The courtroom was abuzz with a hushed anticipation, the kind that settled heavily in the air when something monumental was about to unfold. Rows of polished wooden benches creaked softly as spectators shifted in their seats, each person craning their neck for a better view. The grandeur of the chamber, with its high arched ceilings and the stern seal of justice mounted on the wall, served as a stark reminder of the gravity of the proceedings. When the double doors swung open, a ripple of quiet awe swept through the room. Judge Ava Harris, the first black woman to hold this position in the county, entered with an air of unshakable authority. Her presence was magnetic, commanding respect without the need for a single word. Dressed in her flowing black robe, she walked with a measured confidence, her every step deliberate. Her gaze was steady, her expression unreadable, yet the quiet strength she exuded was palpable. Judge Harris had built her career on a foundation of integrity, becoming a beacon of hope for many in the community who had long felt overlooked by the justice system. To her, this wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a chance to bring balance to a system that often tilted unfairly. But today, as she ascended the bench and surveyed the courtroom, she knew the weight of this case was unlike any other. The allegations against Lieutenant Derek Cole, a high-ranking officer with a reputation for bending the rules, had shaken the county to its core. A bailiff's voice broke through the murmurs. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Ava Harris." The room stood as one, the rustling of fabric and the scrape of chairs blending into a single motion. Judge Harris nodded once, her voice firm yet calm as she instructed everyone to be seated. Her gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on the defendant's table, where Lieutenant Cole sat with a smug grin plastered across his face. His tailored suit and relaxed posture gave the impression of someone who believed himself untouchable, a man who saw the courtroom as little more than a theater for his charm and bravado. Judge Harris, however, was not one to be swayed by theatrics. Her eyes locked with his, unflinching, and for a fleeting moment the grin faltered. As the proceedings began, the tension in the room became almost tangible. Reporters sat poised with their pens and notebooks, their cameras clicking softly as they captured the expressions of everyone involved. Families of the victims, their faces etched with grief and determination, sat huddled together, clutching one another for strength. Opposite them, a handful of Cole's supporters exchanged whispered reassurances, their confidence in him unshaken at least for now. The opening statements painted a picture of a man accused of crossing every line of morality and decency. Cole's alleged misconduct ranged from falsifying reports to using excessive force, with damning evidence that suggested a pattern of corruption. Yet, as the prosecution laid out its case, Cole leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk widening with every pointed statement. It was clear he didn't see himself as a man on trial. He saw himself as the star of the show. Judge Harris, unfazed by his demeanor, listened intently, her pen moving swiftly across her notepad. Every now and then, she would glance up, her sharp eyes taking in the reactions of both the defendant and the audience. There was something about her composure, a quiet, almost unbreakable resolve that began to shift the atmosphere in the room. People started to realize that this wasn't going to be just another case swept under the rug. This was different. She was different. As the prosecution wrapped up its opening, the lead attorney turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we are confident that the evidence will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Lieutenant Cole has betrayed the trust of this community and abused the very power entrusted to him." Judge Harris nodded, her voice steady as she addressed the defense. "Mr. Davis, you may proceed." Cole's lawyer, an impeccably dressed man with a polished demeanor, rose from his seat. "Thank you, Your Honor," he began, his tone dripping with confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is not a case of corruption or misconduct. but a gross misunderstanding, a mischaracterization of a man who has dedicated his life to protecting this community. As he spoke, Cole nodded along, his smirk returning. But Judge Harris was watching closely, her sharp eyes catching the faint flicker of unease behind his confident facade. She could see through the act, and as the opening statements concluded, she knew this trial would be a battle not just of evidence, but of wills. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harris called for a brief recess. As the crowd began to disperse, whispers filled the air, speculation buzzing like an electric current. Judge Harris remained seated, her gaze fixed on the empty space ahead, as if mentally preparing for the storm that was sure to come. The weight of justice pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she welcomed it. This was her moment to show the world that the scales could still be balanced, that power and privilege could not shield anyone from accountability. And as the next chapter of the trial loomed, she knew one thing for certain: she would not falter. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom groaned open once more, and in strolled Lieutenant Derek Cole. His entrance was anything but modest. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his swagger, every step a performance. Dressed in a crisp suit that seemed tailored for intimidation, Cole carried himself with the air of someone who believed the rules did not apply to him. His smirk, a crooked, self-assured twist of his lips, spoke volumes. It was a look that said, "I'm untouchable." The chatter in the room died down as all eyes turned toward him. His presence was magnetic, but not in the way Judge Harris had been. Where her authority inspired respect, his exuded a toxic blend of confidence and entitlement. He didn't need to speak to make his message clear. He was here to put on a show. Cole sauntered to the defense table, ignoring the anxious glances of his lawyer, Mr. Davis, who whispered something in his direction. Whatever was said, Cole waved it off with a flick of his hand, settling into his chair as though he were at a leisurely board meeting rather than a trial for misconduct and corruption. His smirk grew as he scanned the courtroom, his eyes briefly resting on the families of those who had accused him. For a moment, his gaze hardened, but the smirk quickly returned, as if to dismiss their pain as inconsequential. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew thick with tension. To those seated in the gallery, Cole's demeanor was not only disrespectful, but deeply unsettling. Families exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of his arrogance pressing down on them like an invisible force. Among them was Maria Torres, the widow of a man whose encounter with Cole had ended in tragedy. She clutched a worn photograph of her late husband, her knuckles white with the effort. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This was her moment to witness justice unfold, no matter how difficult. Judge Harris observed the scene from her elevated bench, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Though her expression remained neutral, a storm brewed beneath her calm exterior. She had seen men like Cole before, individuals who wielded their power with reckless abandon, leaving devastation in their wake. But what set Cole apart was the audacity with which he flaunted it. "Lieutenant Cole," Judge Harris said finally, her voice slicing through the silence like a knife. "Do you understand the charges brought against you?" Cole leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms leisurely. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his tone dripping with false politeness. "But I'm confident this misunderstanding will be cleared up soon enough." The courtroom stirred, the audacity of his words igniting quiet murmurs among the audience. Judge Harris raised a single hand, and the noise subsided instantly. Her authority was absolute, her command of the room unshakable. "This is not a matter of misunderstanding, Lieutenant," Judge Harris said firmly. "It is a matter of accountability. And I assure you, this court will examine every detail before reaching a verdict." Cole tilted his head, his smirk unwavering. "Of course, Your Honor," he said with a mock bow of his head. I trust the system to be fair." The sarcasm in his voice was thinly veiled, and it rippled through the room like a gust of cold wind. Judge Harris did not react outwardly, but her fingers tightened slightly around her gavel. She knew this trial would test not just the law, but the strength of her resolve. As the prosecution prepared to call their first witness, Cole leaned over to his lawyer, whispering something that drew a reluctant nod from the man. The exchange did not go unnoticed by Judge Harris, whose sharp eyes seemed to take in everything. Meanwhile, in the gallery, Maria Torres shifted in her seat. Her heart ached with every word Cole spoke, every dismissive glance he cast. She had spent the past year mourning her husband, questioning the fairness of a system that allowed men like Cole to rise unchecked. But today, seated among others who shared her pain, she felt something new, a glimmer of hope. Judge Harris was not like the others. She was not intimidated, not swayed by Cole's theatrics. There was a strength in her that gave Maria the courage to believe that justice might finally prevail. As the session continued, Cole's arrogance remained on full display. He laughed quietly at the prosecutor's questions, rolled his eyes at objections, and even whispered jokes to his lawyer. But beneath the surface, there was an edge to his performance, a flicker of something darker. Judge Harris noticed it, and so did Maria. It was the faintest hint of fear, masked by bravado, but impossible to hide completely. The proceedings ended for the day with Judge Harris adjourning the court. As she rose, the room followed suit, the tension still thick in the air. Cole's smirk returned as he exited the courtroom, his movements as deliberate as his entrance. But this time, there was something different. His charm, though still present, seemed a little less invincible under Judge Harris' scrutiny. Outside, the families gathered in quiet groups, their voices filled with hope and doubt in equal measure. Maria clutched her photograph tightly, her resolve hardening. "He won't get away with this," she whispered to herself. "Not this time." And as Judge Harris sat in her chambers, reviewing the day's events, she felt the weight of the trial pressing on her shoulders. She knew the fight ahead would not be easy, but she was ready. Because justice, no matter how long it took, would always be worth it. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Lieutenant Derek Cole reclined in his seat, the smirk on his face sharper than ever. His audacity filled the room like an unwelcome guest, pressing down on everyone present. Judge Ava Harris, seated on the bench with her characteristic poise, studied him intently. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, seemed to peel away the layers of bravado, searching for the man behind the mask of arrogance. Cole leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished table in front of him. His voice, smooth yet edged with disdain, broke the quiet. "Your Honor," he began, his tone dripping with mockery, "I must say, this courtroom has never looked so progressive." A murmur rippled through the gallery like a wave crashing against rocks. The insult, veiled as a backhanded compliment, hung in the air, its impact reverberating through the room. Gasps and whispered outrage followed, but Cole remained unfazed, his grin widening as though he thrived on the chaos he created. He glanced over his shoulder at the audience, his eyes glinting with satisfaction at their reactions. Judge Harris remained composed, though the tension in her jaw betrayed her effort to maintain control. She straightened her back, her hands resting firmly on the bench as she spoke, her voice calm yet commanding. "Lieutenant Cole," she began, each word measured and deliberate, "this courtroom is not a stage for your theatrics. It is a place where justice is sought and delivered. I suggest you treat it, and everyone in it, with the respect it deserves." Her tone was steady, but it carried an undercurrent of strength that silenced the murmurs. All eyes were on her now, the room collectively holding its breath. Even Cole seemed momentarily disarmed, though he quickly recovered, the smirk creeping back onto his face. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I didn't mean any disrespect. Just an observation, that's all." The mockery in his voice was undeniable, and it ignited a fresh wave of whispers from the audience. Maria Torres, seated among the victims' families, clenched her hands tightly in her lap. Her heart ached with a mix of anger and despair as she watched Cole's smug performance. She thought of her late husband, of the injustice that had torn her world apart, and a tear slipped down her cheek. But even in her grief, there was a spark of determination. Judge Harris' calm resolve gave her a glimmer of hope that justice might still prevail. Judge Harris met Cole's gaze without flinching, her expression as unyielding as stone. "Your observation," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "has been noted. But let me remind you, Lieutenant, that this trial is about your actions, not your opinions. I suggest you focus on the matter at hand." The weight of her words settled over the room, silencing even Cole for a moment. The courtroom, filled with the faint creak of shifting seats and the soft hum of air conditioning, felt like a powder keg on the verge of ignition. Every person present could feel the unspoken challenge in Judge Harris' tone, a warning to Cole that his antics would not be tolerated here. Cole leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable for the first time since entering the room. His confidence, though still present, seemed to falter ever so slightly under Judge Harris' scrutiny. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but then closed it again, settling instead for a dismissive shrug. The exchange left the audience electrified. For the families of the victims, it was a moment of validation, a sign that their pain would not be ignored. For Cole's supporters, it was a rare glimpse of vulnerability in their seemingly untouchable champion. And for Judge Harris, it was a reminder of the battle she faced not just against Cole, but against the system that had allowed him to rise unchecked. As the session continued, the tension in the room remained thick. Judge Harris kept her focus, her sharp questioning cutting through the defense's attempts to distract and deflect. Cole's lawyer, Mr. Davis, tried to steer the proceedings back in their favor, but the cracks in their narrative were beginning to show. When the session adjourned for the day, the courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of the trial hanging heavily over everyone. Maria lingered in her seat, her gaze fixed on the bench where Judge Harris had presided. She felt a flicker of gratitude for the judge's strength, her unwavering commitment to justice. As she stood to leave, she whispered a quiet prayer, her voice trembling with emotion. "Please, let this be the start of something right." Meanwhile, Judge Harris sat alone in her chambers reviewing the day's events. Her mind replayed Cole's mocking words, the way he had tried to undermine her authority. She took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the edge of her desk. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but she was ready. She had faced worse challenges in her career, and she knew the importance of standing firm. As the day faded into night, one thing became clear. This trial was not just about Lieutenant Derek Cole. It was about something far greater, a fight for accountability, for justice, and for the community that had suffered far too long. And Judge Harris was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The courtroom doors closed with a heavy thud as the next segment of the trial commenced. The weight of the previous day's events still lingered in the air, an invisible tension that seemed to tighten with every passing moment. Judge Ava Harris took her seat, her expression calm but purposeful, a testament to her determination to see justice served. The gallery, packed with spectators and families, held its collective breath as the proceedings resumed. Lieutenant Derek Cole sat at the defense table, his smirk firmly in place. If the seriousness of the charges weighed on him, he didn't show it. Instead, He exuded a brand of confidence that bordered on defiance, a man determined to bend the situation to his will. Beside him, his lawyer, Mr. Davis, shuffled a stack of papers, his face betraying a flicker of unease as he glanced at his client. Judge Harris addressed the court, her voice steady and authoritative. The court will now proceed with questioning Lieutenant Cole regarding his conduct on the night in question. Cole stood slowly, his movements calculated. He adjusted his suit jacket, casting a brief glance at the gallery, where the victim's families sat with bated breath. His gaze lingered on Maria Torres, who met his eyes with a steely resolve. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, her grief and determination clashing against his arrogance. He turned back to face the judge, his smirk softening into a thin veneer of respect. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth, "I'd be happy to clarify any misunderstandings." The sarcasm in his tone was unmistakable, and it sent a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom. Judge Harris raised a hand, silencing the audience with a single gesture. Her sharp gaze fixed on Cole, her composure unshaken. "Lieutenant Cole," she said, her tone firm, "this is a court of law, not a platform for theatrics. You are here to answer questions, not to deliver a performance." Cole inclined his head slightly, the smirk twitching at the corners of his mouth. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied, his voice laced with mock humility. "I'll do my best to keep it concise." The courtroom tensed as the prosecutor rose, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She approached the stand with an air of confidence, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Lieutenant Cole, can you explain why multiple reports from that evening were inconsistent?" Cole leaned slightly toward the microphone, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Inconsistent, you say? Perhaps it's because fieldwork can be unpredictable. Officers sometimes have to make split-second decisions, and paperwork doesn't always capture the nuance." The prosecutor's expression remained neutral, though her eyes sharpened. "Nuance," she repeated, her voice calm but pointed. "Are you suggesting that the inconsistencies were accidental?" Cole shrugged, his smirk widening. "I'm suggesting that the reports reflect the reality of a chaotic situation. Mistakes happen." The prosecutor didn't flinch. She produced a document, holding it up for the court to see. "Lieutenant, this report includes a statement you signed. It claims the suspect resisted arrest, yet video evidence suggests otherwise. How do you reconcile this?" For a moment, Cole's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "As I said, chaos can distort perceptions. My officers and I acted with the best intentions." From the gallery, a soft gasp escaped Maria Torres. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat, her heart pounding as she listened to his words. The audacity of his defense felt like a slap in the face, a stark reminder of the pain she had endured. Beside her, other families exchanged anguished glances, their faith in the system wavering under the weight of his arrogance. Judge Harris watched Cole closely, her expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Cole," she interjected, her voice steady but firm, "intention is not a justification for misconduct. This court is concerned with facts, not perceptions." Cole opened his mouth as if to respond, but the prosecutor was quicker. "Lieutenant, you've repeatedly avoided taking responsibility for your actions. Do you believe you are above accountability?" The question hung in the air, its weight pressing down on the courtroom. Cole's smirk faltered again, his confidence wavering for the briefest of moments. But then he straightened, his defiance flaring once more. "I believe," he said slowly, his voice steady but laced with sarcasm, "that my record speaks for itself. Years of service, countless commendations, I've earned the benefit of the doubt." The prosecutor stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. This isn't about commendations, Lieutenant. This is about the truth. A hush fell over the room as her words sank in. Cole said nothing, his expression hardening. The tension was almost unbearable, the courtroom holding its collective breath as Judge Harris leaned forward slightly. "This court," Judge Harris said, her voice calm but resolute, "will not be swayed by rhetoric or bravado. The evidence will determine the truth." With that, she struck her gavel, signaling a brief recess. The spectators began to disperse, their murmurs filling the air like static. Maria remained seated, her hands trembling as she stared at the empty stand. Her heart ached with the weight of everything Cole had dismissed, but a spark of hope flickered within her. Judge Harris' words had struck a chord, a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. Cole, meanwhile, exited the courtroom with his lawyer, his smirk returning as he exchanged whispers. But for the first time, there was a hint of unease in his step, a subtle crack in his fod. Judge Harris had seen it, and she knew the battle was far from finished. The truth, though buried beneath layers of arrogance and deceit, would eventually come to light. The courtroom settled into a tense hush as Officer Mark Benson took the stand. His uniform neatly pressed, and the faint sheen of nervous sweat on his forehead spoke volumes about the weight of the moment. His eyes darted across the room, landing briefly on Lieutenant Derek Cole, who sat at the defense table with his trademark smirk. It was the kind of smirk that dared Benson to speak the truth, a silent reminder of the power Cole had once wielded over him. Judge Ava Harris, ever composed and unyielding, leaned slightly forward. Her presence alone seemed to steady the room, offering a silent assurance to all that justice would be served. "Officer Benson," she began, her voice calm but authoritative, "you are under oath. Please remember that the court expects honesty and clarity in your testimony." Benson nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with apprehension. He adjusted the microphone, the small action giving him a moment to gather his thoughts. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with a demeanor as piercing as her questions, approached the stand. "Officer Benson," she began, "you were present during the events in question, correct?" "Yes," he replied, his voice quieter this time. "And during those events, were you given any specific instructions by Lieutenant Cole regarding the official reports?" Benson hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Cole. For a moment, the room held its breath, the tension so thick it seemed to vibrate in the air. Cole leaned back in his chair, his smirk unwavering, but there was a sharpness in his gaze now, a warning cloaked in feigned indifference. Benson exhaled deeply, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. "Yes," he said finally, his voice firm despite the tremor of nerves underneath. "Lieutenant Cole instructed me to alter my report." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by the low murmur of shocked whispers. Maria Torres, seated among the victims' families, felt her heart lurch. Her hands clutched the photograph of her late husband more tightly, her emotions a mix of vindication and sorrow. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized that the truth, long buried beneath layers of deceit, was finally beginning to surface. Judge Harris raised a hand, instantly silencing the murmurs. "Order in the court," she said, her tone firm but controlled. She turned back to Benson, her gaze steady. "Officer Benson, please elaborate on these instructions. What exactly were you told to do?" Benson glanced at the judge, her calm yet commanding presence giving him the courage to continue. "Lieutenant Cole told me to omit certain details," he explained, his voice gaining strength. "He said it was for the good of the department, to avoid unnecessary scrutiny. But I knew it wasn't right." The prosecutor stepped closer, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp. "Did you follow those instructions, Officer Benson?" Benson hesitated, shame flickering across his face. "At first, yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it didn't sit right with me. I tried to speak up later, but—" He trailed off, his eyes darting back to Cole. "But—" the prosecutor pressed. Benson hesitated again, his fingers tightening on the stand. "But I was afraid," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Lieutenant Cole has a lot of influence. People who spoke out against him, well, their careers didn't last long." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Benson's words settling over everyone present. Maria's tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. For the first time, she felt the walls of Cole's carefully constructed FOD beginning to crack. Cole, however, wasn't going down quietly. He shot to his feet, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. "That's a lie," he bellowed, his face flushed with anger. "He's just trying to save himself." Judge Harris banged her gavel sharply, her voice slicing through the chaos. "Lieutenant Cole, you will remain seated and silent unless addressed by this court." "Do I make myself clear?" Cole glared at the judge, his chest heaving, but he sank back into his seat without another word. The smirk was gone, replaced by a clenched jaw and narrowed eyes. For the first time, the room saw not confidence but desperation in his expression. Judge Harris turned back to Benson, her voice softer now. "Officer Benson, the court thanks you for your honesty. I understand that speaking out takes great courage. You may step down." Benson nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief as he left the stand. The weight of his testimony lingered in the room, a powerful reminder of the strength it took to stand against corruption. As the courtroom prepared for the next stage of the trial, Maria felt a glimmer of hope flicker within her. The truth, though painful, was finally being revealed. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she believed that justice might truly prevail. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint creak of chairs as spectators leaned forward, their eyes fixed on Lieutenant Derek Cole. Officer Mark Benson's testimony had left the room stunned, the raw truth of his words still echoing in the minds of those present. The weight of the revelations seemed to press down on Cole, but instead of humility or remorse, his reaction was fury. Cole shot to his feet, his face a deep shade of red, his clenched fists trembling at his sides. "This is outrageous," he bellowed, his voice reverberating off the high ceilings. His lawyer, Mr. Davis, reached out to tug at his sleeve, whispering urgent pleas for him to sit down, but Cole ignored him. He pointed an accusatory finger at Benson, who was now seated among the witnesses, his face pale but resolute. "You're lying," Cole shouted, his voice breaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You're trying to cover your own incompetence by dragging me down with you." The spectators erupted in a cacophony of gasps and whispers, the courtroom quickly descending into chaos. Maria Torres sat frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the edges of the bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded as she watched Cole unravel, his composed FOD crumbling before her eyes. It was a stark contrast to the smirking, confident man who had sauntered into the courtroom just days earlier. Judge Ava Harris wasted no time in restoring order. Her gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room, her voice firm and unyielding. "Lieutenant Cole," she said, her tone cutting through the noise like a blade. "This behavior is unacceptable in my courtroom. Sit down immediately, or you will be held in contempt." Cole froze, his chest heaving as he met Judge Harris' unwavering gaze. For a moment, It seemed as though he might defy her, the rage in his eyes burning bright. But the weight of her authority, combined with the murmurs of disapproval from the gallery, seemed to pierce his anger. Slowly, he sank back into his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed as though he might shatter his teeth. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Harris straightened her robe, her expression calm but resolute. She turned her gaze to the spectators, her voice measured and deliberate. This court is a place of order and respect. I will not tolerate outbursts or attempts to intimidate witnesses. Do I make myself clear? The room nodded in collective agreement, the tension in the air palpable. Cole sat rigidly in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. The smirk that had once been a constant fixture on his face was gone, replaced by a look of barely contained fury. The prosecutor rose from her seat, her expression calm, but her eyes gleaming with determination. She addressed Judge Harris directly. Your Honor, I believe Lieutenant Cole's reaction speaks volumes about the validity of Officer Benson's testimony. His attempt to discredit a witness through intimidation only underscores the pattern of behavior we've seen throughout this trial. Judge Harris nodded, her expression thoughtful. She turned her gaze back to Cole, her sharp eyes seeming to see straight through him. Lieutenant Cole, she said, her voice steady, do you have anything to say for yourself? This is your opportunity to explain your outburst. Cole's jaw tightened further, his eyes darting between Judge Harris and the spectators. For a moment, it seemed as though he might speak, but instead, he leaned back in his chair, his silence heavy with defiance. The prosecutor pressed on. Your Honor, with your permission, I would like to proceed with the presentation of the recorded evidence. Judge Harris nodded. You may proceed. The prosecutor moved to a table near the front of the courtroom, where a stack of documents and a small recording device awaited. She held up a folder. These recordings were obtained as part of an internal investigation and include conversations between Lieutenant Cole and several of his subordinates. They provide insight into his directives and the culture of intimidation he fostered. As the recordings played, the room grew impossibly still. Cole's voice crackled through the speakers, his tone unmistakable. The words, sharp and commanding, painted a picture of a man who wielded power like a weapon, demanding compliance at all costs. Each phrase landed like a blow, eroding the thin veneer of innocence he had tried so desperately to maintain. Maria Torres felt a lump rise in her throat as she listened. The recordings confirmed what she had long suspected. Her husband's death was not an accident, but a consequence of the unchecked authority Cole had abused. Tears slid down her cheeks, but they were not just tears of grief. They were tears of validation, of knowing that the truth was finally coming to light. When the recordings ended, the prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, these recordings are a clear indication of Lieutenant Cole's intent to manipulate and control the narrative surrounding his actions. Judge Harris nodded, her expression unreadable. She turned to Cole, her voice calm but firm. Lieutenant Cole, do you wish to respond to this evidence? Cole remained silent, his defiance now tempered by the weight of the evidence against him. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his next move. But instead of words, he simply shook his head, his shoulders sagging slightly. Judge Harris addressed the court. This trial is about uncovering the truth and holding those responsible for their actions accountable. We will continue to examine the evidence and hear from all relevant parties. Court is adjourned for today. As the room emptied, Maria stayed behind, her gaze fixed on the now empty witness stand. The weight of the trial was heavy, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The walls of Cole's defense were crumbling, and with each crack, the possibility of justice grew stronger. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the prosecutor stood, a determined glint in her eyes. In her hands, she held a file that seemed to hum with the weight of its contents. The gallery leaned forward collectively, their whispers falling to an expectant hush. Even Lieutenant Derek Cole, who had spent much of the trial exuding smug confidence, now shifted uneasily in his seat. His smirk was gone, replaced by a subtle tightening of his jaw. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, her voice calm but resonating with purpose, "we are prepared to present new evidence that directly implicates Lieutenant Cole in a pattern of corruption and abuse of power." Judge Ava Harris nodded, her expression as steady as ever. "Proceed," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become a hallmark of her presence in the courtroom. The prosecutor approached the bench, handing over the file before turning to address the jury and the gallery. "This evidence includes recordings, text messages, and internal reports that were obtained during a whistleblower investigation. These materials provide undeniable proof of Lieutenant Cole's directives to alter reports, intimidate subordinates, and manipulate the system to conceal his actions." The room held its collective breath as the first piece of evidence was presented, a series of audio recordings. The prosecutor adjusted a small speaker on the desk, and within moments, Cole's voice crackled to life. His tone, once smooth and composed, now carried a sharp edge, laden with commands that left little room for interpretation. "I don't care what the report says," his voice boomed through the speakers. "You write it the way I tell you, or you'll regret it." Gasps rippled through the room. Maria Torres, seated among the victims' families, felt her heart tighten. Each word seemed to pierce the air like a blade, cutting through the fog Cole had so carefully constructed. She clasped her hands tightly together, her fingers trembling as she listened to the cold, calculated instructions that had likely contributed to her husband's tragic death. Cole shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table. For the first time, his confidence appeared to waver. His lawyer, Mr. Davis, leaned in to whisper something, but Cole brushed him off, his eyes fixed on the audio recorder as though willing it to stop. The prosecutor played another clip, this time a conversation between Cole and one of his subordinates. "We don't need the truth getting out," Cole said, his tone laced with impatience. "What matters is the department's image. Handle it." The gallery erupted in murmurs, the tension in the room reaching a fever pitch. Judge Harris struck her gavel, restoring order with a firm hand. "There will be silence in this courtroom," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. When the room quieted, the prosecutor continued, "Your Honor, we also have written communication that corroborates these recordings." She held up copies of text messages, which were displayed on a screen for all to see. The messages were brief but damning, clear instructions from Cole to manipulate reports and intimidate witnesses. Maria's breath caught as the words scrolled across the screen. She thought of her late husband, the life they had shared, and the emptiness his absence had left behind. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This was the moment she had prayed for, the moment when the truth could no longer be hidden. As the evidence mounted, Cole's composure began to crack. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his face a mask of barely contained anger. His lawyer's attempts to calm him were met with cold silence, and the once confident lieutenant now looked like a man cornered. The prosecutor turned to face the defense table. "Lieutenant Cole," she said, her voice steady, "do you deny that these recordings and messages are yours?" Cole's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. He said nothing, the silence speaking louder than any denial ever could. Judge Harris leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Cole. "Lieutenant, you are under oath. The court will give you an opportunity to respond. For a moment, it seemed as though Cole might speak. His jaw worked, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. But no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and damning. The prosecutor turned back to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice resonating with conviction, "this evidence is not just a reflection of Lieutenant Cole's actions. It is a reflection of a systemic failure that allowed him to operate with impunity. But today, we have the opportunity to hold him accountable. Today, we have the opportunity to send a message that no one is above the law." The room erupted in applause, a wave of emotion sweeping through the gallery. Maria felt the tears spill over, her heart swelling with a mixture of grief and hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed that justice was within reach. Judge Harris raised her hand, the applause fading into a respectful silence. She turned her gaze to Cole, her expression as unyielding as stone. "The evidence presented today will be taken into full consideration as this trial continues. Court is adjourned for the day." As the courtroom emptied, Maria lingered for a moment, her gaze fixed on the bench where Judge Harris had presided with unwavering resolve. The truth, though painful, had finally been brought to light. And with it came the promise of accountability, a promise that gave her the strength to keep going. The courtroom buzzed with a subdued intensity as the trial resumed the next morning. The previous day's bombshell evidence lingered in the air like a storm cloud, its weight pressing down on everyone present. Lieutenant Derek Cole sat at the defense table, his once smug demeanor replaced with a hard, defensive edge. His lawyer, Mr. Davis, sat beside him, shuffling through documents with nervous energy. Judge Ava Harris entered the room with her characteristic calm authority, her robes flowing as she took her seat on the bench. The gavel struck once, and the room fell silent. "The court is now in session," she announced, her voice steady and deliberate. "Lieutenant Cole, you are invited to present your defense." Cole rose slowly, his movements deliberate, as though each step toward the stand required immense effort. His face was a mask of defiance, but his eyes betrayed the turmoil beneath. He adjusted the microphone, his fingers tightening around its edges. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice calm but strained. "I've spent my entire career serving this community, putting my life on the line to protect and uphold the law. And now I find myself here, accused of actions that are being completely misconstrued." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The room remained silent, the tension palpable. Maria Torres, seated in the gallery, watched him with an intensity that made her chest ache. Her hands gripped the photograph of her late husband, her knuckles white. She had heard words like these before, words meant to deflect, to manipulate, but they felt hollow now, stripped of their power by the weight of the evidence. Cole continued, his tone growing more impassioned. "The recordings you've heard, the reports you've seen, they don't tell the whole story. Yes, I gave orders. Yes, I demanded results. But I did it to protect this community, to ensure that dangerous individuals were held accountable for their actions. Sometimes the choices I had to make weren't easy, but they were necessary." He glanced at the jury, his gaze shifting from one face to the next as though searching for sympathy. "It's easy to sit here now and judge my decisions. But unless you've been in my shoes, faced the dangers I've faced, you can't truly understand the pressures of my position." The gallery murmured softly, divided between skepticism and reluctant consideration. Cole's voice grew louder, his words tinged with desperation. "I've been painted as a villain, but I am not the monster they make me out to be. I've saved lives. I've protected families. And now, because of a few mistakes, I'm being vilified." Maria's breath caught as the word mistakes left his lips. The memory of her husband's final moments flashed in her mind, the weight of his absence pressing against her chest like a heavy stone. She wanted to shout, to demand how he could dismiss so much pain as a mere error in judgment. But she remained silent, her tears falling quietly as she held her ground. The prosecutor rose to her feet, her expression calm but unyielding. "Lieutenant Cole," she said, her voice cutting through the room, "you claim that your actions were necessary. But does necessity excuse deception? Does it excuse manipulating reports, intimidating subordinates, and compromising the very principles of justice you swore to uphold?" Cole's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. "I didn't compromise justice," he snapped. "I did what needed to be done. And if I had to push a few boundaries to protect this community, then so be it." The prosecutor took a step closer, her voice steady and firm. "Lieutenant Cole, protecting a community does not mean placing yourself above the law. The evidence shows a clear pattern of abuse, not isolated incidents, but deliberate, calculated actions to maintain control at all costs." The room held its collective breath as the prosecutor's words hung heavy in the air. Cole's face darkened, his composure slipping further. He turned to the jury, his voice rising with frustration. "I've been railroaded," he declared, his words filled with bitterness. "This isn't about justice. This is about scapegoating. They want someone to blame, and I'm an easy target." Judge Harris leaned forward, her voice calm but authoritative. "Lieutenant Cole, you are here to answer for your actions, not to cast blame. This court will not tolerate theatrics or attempts to deflect responsibility." Cole turned toward her, his mouth opening as though to argue, but he stopped himself. He sank back into his seat, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. The weight of the evidence, the testimony, and his own unraveling defense pressed heavily upon him. The prosecutor addressed the jury once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant Cole has admitted to crossing boundaries, to pushing limits. But this trial is about more than his intentions. It's about the consequences of his actions, the lives that were impacted, the trust that was broken, and the accountability that is required for true justice to prevail." The room fell silent again, the gravity of her words settling over everyone. Judge Harris struck her gavel. "Court is adjourned for today," she announced. "We will reconvene tomorrow to continue proceedings." As the spectators began to file out, Maria remained seated, her gaze fixed on the stand where Cole had delivered his desperate defense. Her heart ached with a mix of anger and hope. The cracks in his armor were growing wider, and with each passing day, the truth shone brighter. For the first time, Maria allowed herself a small, tentative smile. Justice was not just a distant hope, it was becoming a reality. The courtroom was packed as the 9th day of the trial began. The air buzzed with tension, every seat filled by people hungry for justice or answers. Reporters perched like hawks, their pens poised to capture the climax of a case that had gripped the entire county. Families of the victims sat together, united by shared grief and an unspoken hope that today would bring resolution. Among them, Maria Torres held her breath, her hands trembling as she clasped a photograph of her husband. She couldn't afford to let hope falter now. Judge Ava Harris entered the room, her presence commanding immediate respect. The gavel struck, and silence swept across the room like a tidal wave. "The court will come to order," she said firmly, her voice resonating with the authority of a woman who had spent her career fighting for fairness and accountability. Lieutenant Derek Cole sat at the defense table, his face pale but his expression defiant. The events of the past week had stripped away much of his bravado. His once arrogant smirk was now replaced with a guarded glare, and the confidence that had defined his earlier appearances had crumbled under the weight of damning evidence and relentless questioning. Judge Harris glanced toward the jury, her sharp eyes taking in their expressions. She knew the importance of what was to come, not just for the people in this room, but for the entire community. Justice wasn't just a concept to her. It was a promise, a commitment to ensuring that the truth prevailed, no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient it might be. The prosecutor stood, her voice calm but resolute. "Your Honor, before we proceed with closing statements, I would like to address the court directly regarding the gravity of this case." Judge Harris nodded. "You may proceed." The prosecutor turned to face the gallery, her words carefully chosen to cut through the tension. This trial is not just about Lieutenant Cole. It is about the lives that were affected by his actions, about the trust that was shattered. It is about ensuring that those who are sworn to uphold the law are held accountable when they betray that sacred duty. She gestured toward the victims' families, her voice softening. For them, this isn't just a case. It's their lives. It's the loved ones they've lost, the sleepless nights, the unanswered questions. And it's about ensuring that no one else endures the same pain. Maria felt a lump rise in her throat as the prosecutor's words pierced her heart. She clutched the photograph closer, tears slipping down her cheeks. Her husband's face smiled up at her from the picture, a painful reminder of all they had lost, but also of why she was here. When the prosecutor finished, Judge Harris turned her gaze to the defense. "Mr. Davis, you may proceed with your closing statement." Cole's lawyer stood, adjusting his tie nervously. His words were measured, but they lacked the conviction that had once driven his arguments. He spoke of Cole's years of service, his commendations, and his claim that his actions were driven by the desire to protect his community. But the words rang hollow in the wake of the evidence that had been presented. Finally, it was Judge Harris' turn to address the courtroom. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and deliberate. "This trial has been a test not just of one man's actions, but of our commitment to justice as a community. Lieutenant Cole has had his opportunity to defend himself, and the evidence has been thoroughly examined. It is now up to the jury to decide." She turned her gaze to Cole, her expression as unyielding as granite. "Lieutenant Cole, this court has witnessed your attempts to deflect blame, your efforts to manipulate the truth. But the law is not swayed by arrogance or intimidation. It is guided by facts, by evidence, and by the fundamental principle that no one is above accountability." The room held its collective breath as her words sank in. Even Cole seemed momentarily subdued, his defiance dimmed by the weight of her statement. Maria felt her chest tighten, her heart pounding as she watched Judge Harris take control of the moment with a quiet strength that left no room for doubt. Judge Harris turned to the jury, her tone softer but no less firm. "You have been entrusted with a great responsibility. Your decision will not only determine the outcome of this case, but will send a message about who we are as a community. I trust that you will weigh the evidence carefully and deliver a verdict that reflects the truth." With that, she struck her gavel, signaling the end of the session. The jury filed out to begin deliberations, and the room slowly emptied. But Maria stayed behind, her gaze fixed on the bench where Judge Harris had presided. There was something about the judge's words, a quiet power that resonated deeply within her, igniting a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. As she stood to leave, Maria felt a sense of resolve settle over her. This wasn't just about her husband anymore. It was about the future, about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the pain she had felt. And in that moment, she knew that whatever the verdict, Judge Harris had already triumphed. She had shown the world what justice could look like when it was wielded with courage and integrity. Outside the courthouse, The crowd was a mix of reporters, supporters, and onlookers. Maria walked past them, her head held high. She didn't stop to speak, but her presence spoke volumes. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned, their expressions a blend of gravity and resolve. All eyes were fixed on them as they took their seats, the tension in the air thick enough to feel like a physical weight. Judge Ava Harris, ever composed, called the court to order with a single strike of her gavel. "Members of the jury," she said, her voice steady, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson rose, holding a folded piece of paper in trembling hands. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Maria Torres sat in the gallery, her heart pounding so loudly she thought everyone must hear it. She clasped her late husband's photograph tightly, her fingers trembling as she waited for the words that would define this moment. Around her, families of other victims leaned forward in anticipation, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and fear. The foreperson unfolded the paper, her voice shaking slightly as she read the verdict aloud. "On the charge of misconduct and abuse of power, we find the defendant guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment, sinking into the consciousness of everyone present. Then, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by quiet sobs of relief and muted applause. Tears streamed down Maria's face as she whispered, "Justice," the word catching in her throat. It was the vindication she had prayed for, a recognition of the truth she had fought so hard to see acknowledged. Lieutenant Derek Cole sat motionless, his face a mask of disbelief. His once defiant posture had crumbled under the weight of the verdict. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, offering quiet words of consolation, but they seemed to fall on deaf ears. The man who had once commanded a room with his arrogance now looked small and defeated. Judge Harris nodded, her expression resolute. "Thank you, members of the jury, for your service. This court commends your diligence in this matter." She turned her attention to the defendant. "Lieutenant Cole, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. This verdict is a testament to the principle that no one is above the law, not even those entrusted to enforce it. Sentencing will follow." Her words, though calm, carried the weight of finality. Cole slumped in his seat, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if avoiding the eyes of the people whose lives he had impacted. As the courtroom began to empty, Maria lingered, her thoughts swirling. The verdict had brought her a sense of closure, but it couldn't erase the pain of her loss. Her husband was still gone, and the void he left behind would never be filled. Yet there was a lightness in her chest, a sense that his memory had been honored, that his death had not been in vain. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Reporters jostled for space, their cameras flashing, while supporters of the victims cheered and hugged one another. Maria stepped out into the chaos, shielding her eyes from the glare of the sun. As she made her way down the steps, people turned to her, their faces full of recognition and respect. One woman approached her, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you for your strength," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You gave us hope." Maria nodded, her own tears threatening to fall again. "It wasn't just me," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It was all of us." And it was Judge Harris. Judge Ava Harris emerged from the courthouse moments later, her presence commanding as always. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices calling out in gratitude and admiration. Maria watched as the judge paused at the top of the steps, her gaze sweeping over the people gathered below. There was no triumphant smile, no self-congratulatory air, just the quiet dignity of a woman who had fulfilled her duty. As the crowd began to disperse, Maria approached the judge. Their eyes met, and for a moment, no words were needed. Then Maria spoke, her voice steady despite the emotion that filled it. "Thank you, Your Honor." For everything, Judge Harris placed a gentle hand on Maria's shoulder. "Justice is about more than one case," she said softly. "It's about creating a system where people like your husband can trust that their lives matter." "This is just the beginning," Maria nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and determination. The judge's words resonated deeply, reminding her that the fight for justice didn't end with this verdict. It was a journey, a commitment to truth and accountability that required constant vigilance. As Maria walked away, the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the courthouse steps. She clutched her husband's photograph to her chest, her steps steady and purposeful. The path ahead would not be easy, but she knew she was not walking it alone. The voices of the community, united by a shared hope for a better future, would carry her forward. For Judge Harris, the day's events were a reminder of why she had chosen this path. As she returned to her chambers, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that there was still so much work to be done. But she was ready. Because justice, she knew, was not just a destination, it was a promise, one she intended to keep. And so, as the courthouse lights dimmed and the city settled into the quiet of night, the seeds of change had been planted. The fight for justice was far from over, but for now, it was enough to know that truth had prevailed.